I became interested in Reynolds about 40-something years ago when I was in my early 20s. And as I was saying, I don't think there's a day gone by since that time that I haven't thought about Reynolds or considered his art. And I guess things have changed over that time. My opinions have sometimes. I still think whatever Jonathan Jones said in The Guardian this morning, and I haven't read it, he is absolutely a fascinating figure, and he is at the core of the evolution of British art from the 18th century until now. And I'm going to end with the now, with a particular picture that has been in the news very recently. Okay, so Reynolds at 300. What's happened in those years? Let's start with, if I can see, this image here. Self-portrait, President of the Royal Academy, painted around about 1779 to 80. And I think we can say, and I think it's not an idle boast, that at that moment, 1779, Joshua Reynolds was the most famous artist, not just in Britain, but in Europe. And I think he could confidently look around and say, who else is there within the sphere of Western art who has a reputation like mine? And there is nobody. Probably the greatest artist at that time was Tiepolo. Tiepolo died in 1779. So this is Reynolds, President of the Royal Academy, in his, not academic robes, he's in the robes of a Doctor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford, a degree which he had been given, an honorary degree which he'd been given in 1773. We'll come back to that. He's not shown as a painter. He's shown really as President of the Academy. It was painted for the Academy. As a scholar, a writer, a philosopher. He's holding a scroll in his hand, and it still amuses me that the bust, and you see the bust itself, the bust by Daniele della Volterra, a bust of Michelangelo, is in the portrait with him. And it always, as I say, I still smile when I look at it because it looks like Michelangelo is sort of bowing in deference in the background to Joshua rather than the other way around. But he was the artist, even though his art is very different, what he paints is very different, he was the artist that Reynolds revered more than anything. And when he gave his final lecture, his final discourse at the Royal Academy in 1790, he said, the very last words that I would like to pronounce in this academy is Michelangelo. So he aimed high, you know, when he was thinking about who he wished to compete with and who mattered. So let's go back to the beginning. Some of this stuff you'll be familiar with. You live here, many of you. You know this area far better than I do. But yes, it all goes back to Plymouth. It all actually goes back to Plympton. I'm not going to give you a potted biography. I think most of you will know his father was a schoolmaster, Samuel Reynolds, just round the corner. I've just come from the grammar school here, and I've just stood for the very first time in my life in the schoolroom that Reynolds learned his lessons in, and I found it very evocative. So this is a self-portrait from about 1746. This is Reynolds in his early 20s. It's now in Plymouth City Museum and Art Gallery. When I first saw it, it was in a private collection somewhere in the southwest. I'm showing it next to a self-portrait of Godfrey Kneller. And you don't need an art historian to tell you that Reynolds is modeling his own self-portrait upon that of Godfrey Kneller. Now, Godfrey Kneller had been, since the reign of Charles II, painter to the king. He was the most celebrated, the most important artist in England, and he maintained that post right the way through, virtually until his death in 1723. The year that Kneller dies is the year that Reynolds is born, which I always think is a nice kind of segue. Just a few months before little Joshua emerges onto the planet, Godfrey Kneller leaves. And right from the beginning, Reynolds set his sights very high. He wanted to be the next Godfrey Kneller. He wanted to be painter to the king. And there's always that phrase, his father was a schoolmaster, one of his brothers was an ironmonger, and he might have been trained as an apothecary. And he said, I'd rather be an apothecary than an ordinary painter. So although portraiture occupied a lot of his time, he didn't just want to paint portraits. This, I think, is an astonishing portrait, whatever anybody thinks. Around about 1746, maybe a year or two later, so Reynolds is about 23 years old. It is an incredibly accomplished picture. Reynolds actually thought so too. He saw it towards the end of his life. So he painted in his early 20s. When he was in his 60s, he saw it again. And he said, it makes me feel really miserable. I feel I've made no progress. How good was I in my 20s? And it's this portrait of Captain Hamilton, Captain the Honourable John Hamilton, who was a captain, a military captain, and an aristocrat. And it's painted in the manner of Titian, this wonderful hussar's, furry hussar's outfit, the pose, it's been called a sort of portrait of senatorial dignity. Incredibly, Reynolds is a mold breaker from the get-go. He trains under an artist called Thomas Hudson, whom I think you'll all have heard of, in the early 1740s. He has a good technical training. He falls out with Hudson, they become reacquainted, and he oscillates in the 1740s between here, literally here, Plymouth Dock, Plympton and London. He's moving between the two. This place, the people who live here, the people who patronize him, remain important to him for the rest of his career, and he builds his career on the patronage of those families, people like the Hamiltons. And, of course, I have to mention these two chaps, Paul Henry Ury and Captain George Edgecombe, both painted in 1748, and eerily, both used to be in this very room, painted by Reynolds in his mid-20s, commissioned by the Corporation of Plympton to hang in this room. And wouldn't it be wonderful if they were still hanging in this room? I saw one of them earlier today. I was at Saltram. I hopped down to Saltram today and joined the curators there, and I saw the portrait of Ury, which is now at Saltram, so at least it's close by. The portrait of George Edgecombe is now in the Royal Museums at Greenwich, what used to be called the Maritime Museum. Both naval officers, Ury as the lieutenant to Captain George Edgecombe. They have a very local, specific connection to, obviously, the Navy, because this is everything about this area is connected to the Navy, but also importance. These are the families who run. They run the politics, they run the borough, they run patronage. Ury is married into a family called the Trebys that you'll have come across. So he's very astute, and he knows he needs these patrons. So this actually acts as a kind of show space for Reynolds in the area. So if anybody wants to know what Reynolds is capable of doing, they can come here and they can see what he's up to. I think the 40s is the most interesting, and I'd always wanted to do, and maybe I still will do, an exhibition on Reynolds in the 1740s. This is a portrait from around about the same period. You'll all know it, I'm sure. It's in the National Portrait Gallery, and it's a self-portrait where it's one of, she painted over 20 self-portraits throughout his career. I think this is one of the most extraordinary, very much in the manner of Rembrandt. Reynolds is constantly comparing himself to artists of the past, to Titian, to Rembrandt, to Michelangelo, and so on. He emerges from the shadows, and it's where his hand is, it's almost visionary. He's looking towards the future. It's very theatrical, it's very dramatic, and that wonderful, expert way in which he's cast the shadow across his eyes, almost like the Lone Ranger. It's almost like a kind of mask across his eyes. There's often been said that this portrait has been cut down, because you can see it's unusual. Usually portraits are that way around, but this is like that. But what he's actually done is he's taken a standard size canvas, which is usually 30 inches long by 25 wide, and he's just flipped it on its side. So he's actually said, well, I need to get it more expansive, so I'll just turn it around. It's typical kind of Reynoldsian thing to do. All right, something more personal. This self-portrait, around about 1750, I first saw it at Christie's South Kensington about 20 years ago. And I walked, it was a sale at Christie's, and it said portrait of an artist, portrait of a young man. And I looked at it and I thought, my goodness me, that not half looks like Joshua Reynolds. And the label said, portrait of an artist, a young man, £400. And I thought, thank you, God. this is good. So I kind of, went home, thought about it. And then I got a phone call from a very nice chap called Francis Russell at Christie's. And he said, Martin, we've been thinking about this. Do you think it looks like anybody? And I said, yeah, unfortunately, it looks like Joshua Reynolds. And I think it's a self-portrait by Joshua Reynolds. And that's what it turned out to be. Good news is it was bought by my employer, not for £400, but for £100,000. And it's now at Yale University at the Yale Centre for British Art, which I'm very pleased about. But it was painted by Reynolds in Italy, in Rome. And I haven't got, this is a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour. Italy was incredibly important for Reynolds. He went in 1749, he came back in 1752. He spent 3 years in Italy, and it was, I think, the nearest that we can think of it as a kind of university education. It was terribly important for him to go and see Italian old master paintings at the source. And now often, most of us go on holiday or we travel somewhere. If we go for 3 months, we think, gosh, that was a long time. If we go for 6 months, that's an incredibly long time. But 3 years, and it changed his life. And he never let anybody else forget that it changed his life. I have been to Italy for a very long time, and I have seen the old masters. And he lived off it. This is I like this as a comparison. This is a self-portrait. It's inscribed Rome, May 1750. It didn't used to be. It's hard to believe now. That was attributed to another artist and a picture of another artist by another artist. But it's clearly Reynolds. It's Reynolds in Rome. And as I say, the portrait was also painted at that time. So self-promotion, in fact, was very key to Reynolds. This portrait disappeared for hundreds of years. We think almost certainly that Reynolds left the portrait in Rome. He left it hanging in Rome, in his lodgings. And somebody else saw it later, and eventually it found its way back to this country. Now, we can see the seismic effect that Italy had on Reynolds in the work that he produced afterwards. This is another, this is a sort of, there will be portraits you haven't seen. There will be things less familiar. But this portrait he painted when he came back, settled in London, and he painted it of Augustus Viscount Keppel. Keppel remained a close family friend for the rest of his life. Like many of the Reynolds' close friends, male friends, he was a naval officer. In fact, he had given Reynolds a lift to the continent in his boat. It docked here. It's called the Centurion. Reynolds hopped on board, and basically Keppel gave him a lift to the Mediterranean. And he was eternally grateful to Keppel for that. It's a transformative portrait. It transforms the whole meaning of what a formal, official, public portrait can be. It's Keppel as a man of action. Yes, he's a naval officer, but he's a hero. It's a kind of confined, as it was called, history painting. He's striding across a beach. There's a storm clouds ahead. There's a ship in the background that has shipwrecked. He is an all-action hero. And it was very different when he produced that and he painted it and he kept it in his studio. It upset a number of people. They said, this isn't how you paint portrait. This isn't what an official portrait it looks like. What's he up to? He's moving in a landscape. So some of the most significant portraits that Reynolds painted over the next few years, the ones I'm going to show you over the next few minutes, were all done not for money, not for commissions. He was doing lots of portraits that he did make money from. He had standard fees. He was really successful. He was terribly well organized with his time. He worked 7 days a week. You can look at his sitter books and look at his pocket books. He is not a time waster. But when he sees somebody who captures his attention for various reasons, he would paint their portrait of his own volition, hang it in his showroom, and use it as a promotional material. This is a good example of this. 1756, Captain Robert Orme. Captain Robert Orme, unlike Augustus Keppel, is not a nobody. He's a kind of universal soldier. He'd come back from the American wars, and he wrote an account. And for a moment, he was in the news. He'd been involved in a battle where the British actually lost. It was the Battle of Monongahela River. A lot of the British soldiers were killed. He came back and told this fairly horrific story of what he'd been through. And Reynolds thought, this is an extraordinary, gripping story, and I'm going to paint this man's portrait. I don't want any money for it. I'm going to keep it. And he kept it in his studio for the next 20 years. And it sat in Reynolds's showroom in his exhibition space, promotion space, until it was bought by another soldier, a man who'd been in the Grenadier Guards, a man called Murrogh O'Brien, who was the Earl of Inchkin. Quite a significant man because he went on to marry Reynolds' niece much later on in life, but he was the owner of this portrait. What could be more different than this portrait of Kitty Fisher, painted a few years later, which used to be not very far from here. It was at Saltram. It's now at the Ivor Bequest in Kenwood. But again, she was the talk of the town. Everybody wanted to know Kitty Fisher, so Reynolds painted her portrait. She was in the gossip columns, but he doesn't paint her as a contemporary courtesan. He paints her as Cleopatra, the libidinous queen of Egypt, dropping the pearl into the goblet of wine. That is a very, I'm not going to go into this, but that is a very suggestive gesture that she's doing, okay? Take my word for it. Anybody in the 18th century, if you do that, it's not polite, okay? So she's doing something very impolite. And that portrait was bought by a man called Charles Bingham. He didn't take it home, couldn't take it home. He kept it in his gentleman's club. He was Lord Lucan. Not the Lord Lucan, obviously, we know, but that was a descendant of this chap. So Reynolds, again, he realized that I want to be connected with people who matter, people who are in the news. There's another example. 1761, he exhibits a portrait of a man who has just made the headlines with a book called The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. It came out over a period of years. Lawrence Sterne. Reynolds paints his portrait. It's not a conventional portrait of a vicar, I think, and you don't need me to say that. He was a novelist, he was satirical, he was a little bit dangerous. He'd written books that were actually burnt in the past. And he's basically telling you all about where his genius comes from. It's actually not coming from up there, it's coming from his cranium. And it's this wonderful, spotlit kind of character study. And I'm not going to mention Jonathan Jones yet again in this lecture, but this is not painted by a hack. This is painted by somebody who has every bit as brilliance as the man he's painting. It's supremely clever, evocative portrait of somebody who was, how do you capture brilliance? How do you capture literary brilliance? How do you capture humor? How do you capture satire in a portrait? He does it all here. In 1762, he comes down back to Plympton. He comes with by then one of his closest friends. He comes with Samuel Johnson. He stays with his sister. He has a number of sisters, and he paints members of the family. And he paints this little girl. And this is Mary, his 3-year-old niece. I don't think any of you will have seen it before. It's in private collection. Paints this in 1762. It descended right the way through the family. Reynolds was actually a difficult relationship with certain members of his family. Her mother, Elizabeth, really disapproved mightily. She was a very pious woman. Remember, his father was a vicar. Elizabeth was very pious. She wrote religious tracts. She thought Reynolds was going to hell. She told him so. She said, your soul is a shocking spectacle of poverty. Basically, you're going to go to hell because you don't go to church. You hang out with all these people that you shouldn't be hanging out with. And yet there's this wonderfully kind of affecting private side of Reynolds' portrait. Again, this is done for pleasure. It's done as a gift, a family gift. What about a portrait that's not by Reynolds, but of Reynolds? I love this. This is at Saltram. Many of you will know it. It's by his friend Angelica Kaufmann, who was herself, obviously, an artist. 1767. She comes back to England. And Reynolds is not, as you know, he never marries. He doesn't, as far as we know, have close relations. But he has a lot of female friends. And he really, obviously, admired Angelica, and she admired him. She was very gifted. She was a gifted artist. She was a gifted musician. And she paints this wonderful, it's a portrait it's an image you're never going to see of Reynolds by himself. And he's holding his ear. He's pointing to or adverting to his deafness. Again, there's Michelangelo. There's the bust of Michelangelo. No, not a paintbrush in sight. There are writings. There are things that he's written. He's just started writing essays for a journal called The Idler, which was edited by Samuel Johnson. And he's in a Van Dyke costume. This is Reynolds as a young, well, he's not that young by then. He's a lover, which I always find a wonderful kind of idea. And this is Angelica herself, painted by Nathaniel Dance, the man that had actually been having a relationship with Angelica when she first came to England. And this is Dance's portrait of Angelica Kaufmann. I love this drawing. You might have seen it before. It belongs to the Earl of Harewood. It's by Dance, and it's Reynolds in conversation with Angelica. It's a smashing little drawing. And you can see he's craning forward. He's holding his ear. She seems to have her hand on her heart. I don't know. But she's got a palette, and she's got some paints in her hand, and somebody in the background is playing a musical instrument. So I do like this private side, because one of the things about Reynolds that tends to happen is we think of him as a public figure. We think of him as somebody who is always living life in the public sphere, but that's not the case. This is my favorite of all portraits, self-portraits of Reynolds from the mid-1770s. It's one of a series of portraits that he painted for a man called Henry Thrale, who was a brewer for his house in Streatham in South London. And it's a series of portraits that are known as the Streatham Worthies. And these are basically friends of Thrale, friends of his wife, wonderful woman, Mrs. Thrale, Mrs. Piozzi. And there's a whole series of male character studies of him and his close friends. Giuseppe Baretti, who was a translator, a poet, quite a feisty character. He'd just been acquitted of murder a few years before. He'd stabbed a man in the street who'd attacked him. Stabbed him with a fruit knife, which I always find kind of, it must have been a hell of a fruit knife. But he was let off. But it's this intimate, kind of private. And then Johnson, of course. Johnson didn't like this portrait very much. He said, you can paint yourself deaf if you like, but I'm not going to be blinking Sam. I don't want my physical shortcomings brought forth. Johnson, terribly important for Reynolds. They meet in the 1750s. They form a club, which is basically a club that allows Johnson to talk and other people to listen, and it becomes the club, the Johnson Club. Still exists today. It's been reignited. There is a Johnson Club to this day, and people still sit around and chat to each other and give little papers and essays and things. So that's Reynolds' private world. But I'm going to move on now swiftly to the other big watershed in Reynolds' life. And of course, that is the Royal Academy of Art. Reynolds had a complicated relationship with the Royal Academy. We always think of him as the president, and he was the first president, but he resisted it wholeheartedly at the beginning. He was a founder member, but he didn't engineer it. He was asked to be the first president simply because they thought that he would be the best person to do it. And he does this whole kind of, oh, yes, I will, no, I won't, yes, I will, no, I won't, with people who are really committed to it, artists who are really committed to it, like William Chambers and others. And what does he do? He says, I'll go and talk to my friends. So he has a chat with Edmund Burke. He has a chat with Samuel Johnson. He has a chat with the others in his close circle. And they say, yeah, we think you should do it. So he comes back and says, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And then under certain terms. And you all know this portrait, I hope. It's in the Royal Collection. I'm going to show you a little detail. There's Reynolds in black, the man in black. And he's standing next to the man in brown, who is Dr. William Hunter, who is the professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy. And again, not a paintbrush in sight, but what he does have is a sword, because he's just been knighted. He is now officially Sir Joshua Reynolds, and this must have tickled him pink, because he's thinking back to Sir Godfrey Kneller, Sir Peter Lely, Sir Anthony Van Dyck. Yes, I have made it. I'm at the top of the tree. And he's holding in his hand, of course, is his wonderful silver ear trumpet. Reynolds was genuinely very hard of hearing, and that's not an invention. He needed an ear trumpet. He told people that the reason, and I'm sure many of you know this, the reason that he was deaf is because he'd spent far too long in the Sistine Chapel, lying on the cold floor, or sitting there day after day, and he'd caught a chill, and he went deaf because of it. But then it's interesting that quite a number of other members of his family who'd never been to the Sistine Chapel also seem to have this issue. But let's pass on over that. He starts to broaden his horizons in terms of what he paints during the 1770s. And they're not, funny enough, they're not always the flavour of the month. This is at Kenwood House. It's a bit of a Marmite picture, I think it's fair to say, Venus chiding Cupid. But you have to see it within the time it was made and it was conceived. This is Reynolds appealing to a contemporary European taste. And that taste specifically is French fashionable art. He had just come back 3 years earlier from Paris, where he'd spent time with a number of French artists, notably François Boucher and Van Loo, Jean-Michel Van Loo. He'd been to their studios. He prided himself that he was part of an international community. He knew what posh aristocrats, men, courtiers liked, and he was quite prepared to paint these pictures because they amused people. It's a kind of allegorical portrait of the relationship between love and money. Venus is telling off Cupid because he's doing his sums. She's holding up a blunt arrow. It's inverted, it's just sexual, it's a blunt arrow. And the little Puto next to him is pointing to a sharp arrow and having a laugh at his expense. So to us, the values behind it, the allegories behind it seem rather alien, rather strange, rather difficult, and we're not expected, and I wouldn't expect anybody speaking like this, but sometimes we have to try and understand where these things come from and why Reynolds was interested. He also painted serious pictures. This is his first history painting of any note. Ugolino and his children in the dungeon. It's based on a story from Dante. And this is Reynolds' attempt to say, okay, I'm now the president of the Academy. I paint portraits. I write about art. I talk about art. I give discourses. I have to produce history. I have to produce serious high art. And this is his stab at doing that. It's semi-successful. It's a strange picture. But at the time, it made a big impact. And it was engraved. It started off as a single character study because you have to remember, Reynolds was not trained in history painting. He was trained in portraiture, so he had to kind of relearn it. The model for Ugolino was a beggar, a very celebrated beggar called George White, who everybody used at the time. And you see the man at the right there's a man doing this, clutching his face. The model for that is his pupil, a man called James Northcote, who's also, those of you who know about these things will come across Northcote. Northcote is a fellow Devonian. He trained for 6 years with Reynolds. We know a lot about Reynolds, because Northcote wrote his first biography. And I haven't got time to go into their relationship, maybe, so we can talk about that something else. But he knew more about how Reynolds' studio ran, the way in which Reynolds operated. I'm going to show you a self-portrait, which I think is smashing. This is in a house just down the road from here, I suppose. This is in Trewithen. Many of you know Trewithen in Cornwall, yeah? Which is a wonderful house, lovely garden. And they've got this portrait, which when I came across it about 2 or 3 years ago, I'd never seen this. It's not in the public. It simply has been sitting there with a number of very other interesting portraits by Reynolds and by Northcote. And this is his self-portrait. Now, the slide on the left is in black and white. There's a very good reason it no longer exists. I don't have, and I don't think I've come across a colour image of it. But I did want to show it to you. If I can find I'll paraphrase it. Basically, Northcote tells us, he writes a letter to his brother Samuel, who's in Devon, and he says, what have I been up to? Well, I'm doing this, I'm going to the theatre, and, Sir Joshua has just painted this picture of this little girl called Child. He just says she's called Miss Child, She's very nice. She's only 7 or 8 years old, and she's going to be worth £30,000 a year. That suddenly is rather more interesting. She's very, very wealthy. And then he said, and I painted the cage. He tells his brother, he said, I painted the cage and I painted the weeds. It's by me. And in the next paragraph, he says, oh, and by the way, Sir Joshua's coming down to Plymouth next week. He's going to be made an alderman, and he's coming back home. And yes, of course, then he comes back home. This portrait used to hang in this space as well. I'm sure it's in a private collection now. It's in a house called Orchard Wyndham. Don't know if you've come across Orchard Wyndham. It is open to the public occasionally. It's owned by the Egrements, Lord Egremont's family. And the reason for that is that when the portraits were dispersed from here in the 1830s, he bought this portrait of Reynolds. I don't have time, I'm aware of time to tell the whole story, but Reynolds was very keen to become mayor of Plympton. And in order to do so, to help his campaign, he decided at breakneck speed to paint a self-portrait specifically to be hung here in the corporation so that his face would literally be in front of everybody. And he said that he basically painted it in a day, which is fast, stuck it in a packing box, sent it off, and apparently when it arrived, it was covered in sawdust because the varnish hadn't dried. He was that keen because it still mattered to him. And I think some of his London friends thought, why do you want to be mayor of Plympton? Why does that matter to you? Well, it mattered to him as much as being president of the Royal Academy, being a member of the Uffizi, the Italian Academy. These things matter. Honours mattered to Reynolds, and local honour mattered to him as much as national honours. At the same time, he painted this self-portrait, which he sent to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And I would say that they were equally important to him. And this, I'll tell you a little story. We borrowed this picture, the Uffizi picture, for an exhibition I did in 2005 called Joshua Reynolds, The Creation of Celebrity. And the first venue was in Ferrara. And I was waiting. The courier, the curator from the Uffizi arrived with this picture, this self-portrait. He said, I have the portrait of Joshua Reynolds. Where would you like it to be hung? And we said, well, could we hang it here? And we had all the art handlers because, these things are very precious. He said, well, how would you like us to hang it on the wall? Because we had all the screws and everything ready. He said, you put a nail in the wall, you hang it on the wall. It's, it's like, he said, are you sure? Because, a bit of wire. He said, he belongs to the Uffizi. Nobody steals from Uffizi. So it's like, it's not going anywhere. But more interesting than that is when we flipped it over, because it's on what's called an unlined canvas, so you can actually see the raw canvas. Reynolds had written in his own hand all his titles on the back. Everything, So, Mayor of Plympton, President of the Royal Academy, and it goes on, and he'd just written it all there in case anybody in Italy forgot who he was. And I'm just showing this. This is a portrait of his great European rival at the time, Anton Raphael Mengs. Very different as an image. Again, Reynolds doesn't have a paintbrush. He has a scroll. He has doctoral robes. He's a philosopher, whereas Mengs he looks immediately more like an artist. And it's quite interesting. Somebody at the time compared these two self-portraits. They noticed that Mengs's portrait was painted very finely and very carefully, and they said Reynolds's looks like it'd been painted with his fingers. It was so broad-brushed. So, I've got about 5 minutes, maybe more, if you allow, bear with me. Reynolds, they moved to the Royal Academy in 1780, moves to Somerset House, which you'll all know. Again, terribly important for Reynolds. He needs to make another statement. You find that the self-portraits tend to happen when he has to make a statement about something big in his life. So that's when he produces this self-portrait for the Royal Academy of Arts. It's an inset in the great room, in the assembly room, one either side of the chimney, the president of the Academy, and the treasurer, Sir William Chambers. And these two portraits, they still belong to the Royal Academy of Arts, no longer at Somerset House. But again, it's interesting to make the comparison with this room here about the importance of public places to hang public portraits, and the fact that the portrait is there to represent you when you're maybe not there, but to remind people of who you are and what you do. I just can't resist showing you this. You might not have seen it before. It's Reynolds as a shepherd with his colleague, Thomas Jarvis, who was a stained glass or a painted window painter. Reynolds was commissioned to paint a window for an Oxford college, for New College, Oxford. And he couldn't resist putting himself literally in the picture. And so you probably won't be able to see detail. This is the window. Any of you been to New College and seen this? You have to go on a very, very, very sunny day. Otherwise, it looks like the inside of a cheese grater. But there's a nativity in the middle, Virtues at the bottom, and Reynolds is the second from the left. He was very canny. He got the college to pay him for all the designs, and then he kept the painted designs, and then he sold the nativity for £1,500 to the Duke of Rutland. So that's smart, you know. That's when you think, well, how is he making all this money if he's painting all these pictures for nothing? It's because he was a fantastic businessman, a very astute businessman. This is more successful. This is Mrs. Siddons. This, again, is one of the great, clever, iconic, portraits by Reynolds as the tragic muse. She's the personification of the tragic muse. It's Michelangelo-esque, of course it is. Mrs. Siddons actually believed she'd invented the pose. It's quite funny. He says, well, I just walked in and I just, sat there and he painted me. Well, of course, she's not. She's Isaiah. She's basically posed as a prophet from the Sistine Chapel. But it's that kind of sublime image of she becomes the embodiment of tragedy. It wasn't all roses towards the end of Reynolds' life. Yes, he was the president of the RA. Yes, he was the best-known artist around. Yes, of course, he had rivals, Gainsborough, and so on. But the Royal Academy itself, by the 1780s, was kind of busting open at the seams in many ways. Lots of people didn't really want to exhibit there anymore. They were seceding from it. Gainsborough didn't, Wright of Derby didn't, Stubbs didn't, and Reynolds was almost single-handedly, as a major artist, keeping it going. And if you look at the number of works he was exhibiting, they increased year by year. So early 1770s, maybe 3, maybe 4 paintings a year. Go to the late 1780s, 16, 17, 18 pictures a year. He's producing lots of work. Just to think, I want to keep this thing going. And this, almost the last portrait by Reynolds, is self-portrait of 1788. We showed it in the exhibition I did at the Tate. Reynolds as this kind of almost seer-like figure. When we hung it on the wall, and you walked straight up to it, it almost seemed to dissolve in front of you. His technique, and there'll be others here, we could maybe talk about his technique, was fickle in certain ways, but it doesn't undermine the power of the image. I think sometimes we can talk about technique and say, he experimented, they've lost something. But sometimes there's something, I rather like this because it's an image of old age. I've got a few more minutes, I hope, and I just want to talk a little bit about his afterlife, just briefly to take us up to the now. Even during his lifetime, Reynolds was lionized in sort of sculpted form. This is a bust that was made. It almost looks as if it should be posthumous, but it was made during his lifetime by an Italian sculptor called Ciracchi. It's one of a number of series of busts that he made of famous people. Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Napoleon Bonaparte, Joshua Reynolds. Pretty good. And so Reynolds is in that, he's already in that kind of transcends being a painter. He's buried in St. Paul's, we know that. There's a statue of him in St. Paul's Cathedral, eventually erected in 1830, paid for mainly by his niece, Mary. There's a wonderful story behind it. I can't tell it. It would take too long. But she got him there. She got the statue there. And people collected there was a kind of collective memory about Reynolds and a British school. People like Lord Egremont, who I've mentioned, bought this kind of very large, weird picture of Macbeth and the Witches, which still hangs today at Petworth. You may know it. Strange work, but it still has a kind of aura about it. But again, it was representative of what... It's not perfect. It's got a lot of kind of issues with it, but I think it's quite valiant in a way that Reynolds is saying, well, I do believe in literary painting, I do believe in history painting. He's championed mainly at that time through people in the British institution. This is just a little picture of the institution. There's dear old Northcote in old age, a picture by Reynolds of the Holy Family. That picture was one of the earliest pictures to enter the National Collection, and I show it because you're never going to see it. It belongs to the Tate. They're never going to show it. And it's not great in many ways. It has flaws, but it just lies in the storerooms among, lots of other things. I feel quite strongly about these things. A picture that does get out more often is this picture of Lord Heathfield. Again, I'm showing it to you because it was one of the pictures that entered the National Gallery when the National Gallery was first formed in 1824, and it belonged to a banker called John Julius Angerstein. So it was one of the core collection. So when people were going to a public museum in the 1820s to look at public art, this is what they would see if they wanted to look at Reynolds. You all know this, I think. There are two versions. There's one in the Tate. It used to be in the National Gallery. It does belong to the National Gallery. It was bequeathed in 1847. And this one in Plymouth. I'm kind of getting more interested. I used to be a bit wary about the one in Plymouth, thinking maybe it's a copy and maybe it's studio. I think there's more Reynolds in it than we think. But the reason I'm showing it to you now is because when this picture, when the one presented to the National Gallery, was presented to the National Gallery, there were more copies made of it than any other picture. So between, I think I got my dates right, about 1850 and 1890, there were 323 full-size copies in oil made of this picture. And that's why you can imagine, quite often I get letters from people saying, oh, I've got this picture by Reynolds of the Age of Innocence. Well, maybe not quite. I'm going to click forward. If you bear me, I could talk about these, but I'm not going to. What I really wanted to talk about was the cult of Reynolds is big in the 19th century. There is this kind of the idea of what must it have been like to have lived with Reynolds and with his friends, with Burke and Johnson. And there's quite a lot of genre painting produced at the time. 1892. The centenary of Reynolds' death, the Graphic, produces this wonderful image, which I think is supposed to be Reynolds painting Mrs. Siddons, and he's got his ear trumpet on the table. That's quite fun. This is wonderful. This is by Francis Barrow. Sir Joshua Reynolds' studio, a visit from Dr. Johnson, 1912. Well, of course, it's Heathfield, so he's standing by the fireplace, as you do. I just dropped in to have my portrait painted, Sir Joshua. And who should pop along but Samuel Johnson, just to take a look. It's lovely, but it's this. There's a whole series of these things. You will know another picture by Barrow. You won't know it's by him, but if I tell you what it is, it's a little Jack Russell by a gramophone, HMV. That's by Barrow. So Reynolds is being collected big time at this time by Americans. There's a drain of pictures leaving this country, and that's at the end of the 19th century why pictures like this go to American galleries like the Huntington, like the Frick, and so on. The golden age of portraiture. These pictures are sold for vast, vast sums of money. And this is very personal to me. It was bequeathed to the Tate Gallery in 1900 by a man called Henry Vaughan. And it's a full-size 8-foot marble statue of Sir Joshua Reynolds. We showed it in 2005 in the exhibition. We had it cleaned for the exhibition. And after the exhibition, where did it go? Back to the stores. So it's in a wooden box. It's like Indiana Jones. You know that bit at the end when he walks down? That's what it's like. I was there last week. I said, where is it? Oh, it's right at the back. It's in a box. But to move on to brighter things, I'm going to skip that. That's in the 1920s, the Royal Academy acquired its own, or wanted to acquire its own memorial to Reynolds. And they had a little competition between two sculptors, a chap called Derwent Wood, and he did about half a dozen of these. These are his ideas. And then this chap did one, a man called Alfred Drury. And that's his plaster cast for the statue that now sits outside the Royal Academy. And I'm going to show you a lovely photograph. There it is, being installed outside the Royal Academy, still there today. He wears a garland from time to time. I think Drury's the man in the middle, but I'd love to know who the two guys in the very fashionable raincoats on the left are. I think they're academicians. Just a couple more things and I'll stop. We talked about the 250th anniversary, 1973. I think more fuss, and I will be honest, I think more fuss was made, and I don't think enough fuss is being made at the moment for the 300th. There was a first day cover. I love this one. I actually own it. I think it cost me £5. It belonged to Mr. Samuel Towers, who was the stamp columnist of the New York Times. They had a stamp columnist. It was his job. He ran a column on stamps, as well as being an editor. And so he got a copy of this. But it's the 250th birthday of Sir Joshua Reynolds, and you could get a stamp. I first came across Reynolds in 1986 when we had an exhibition. There was an exhibition at the Royal Academy. For me, that was the standout picture in the exhibition. Garrick between tragedy and comedy. And that's another one of those pictures that Reynolds has the ability to stand outside his own oeuvre. Of course, he painted 2,000 portraits. He probably painted 1,000 that aren't very good. But he probably painted a couple of hundred which are incredible, and this is one of them. I could do I'm not going to, because you're going to tell me to shut up in a minute, but David Garrick, Between the Muse of Tragedy and Comedy, is a great piece of invention, a great piece of pictorial invention appealing to the traditions of European art. He could also paint things like this, which, again, sadly, I don't think any of us are going to see in the near future, because it's in the Hermitage, and it was painted for Catherine the Great. It got to the exhibition in 1986, but I don't think we're ever going to see it again. The infant Hercules strangling the serpents. Not a great picture, but one that Reynolds spent an awful lot of time on because it was for Catherine the Great. He said there are 40 pictures underneath this one. Some are better, some are worse. So we didn't know what was going to be underneath. Right, I'm going to finish with one more image, just one more. In 2000, we published this book. I worked alongside. David did most of it, David Mannings, but I did some of it. The complete catalogue of the paintings of Sir Joshua Reynolds. It makes an excellent doorstop. And I say that because I have a friend who uses it as a doorstop every time I go to his house. It's never moved since he got it. He's a retired English professor. And I say, oh, it's just still there. He said, oh, yes, it's very useful. Now, there was one picture that at the time when we did the catalogue, it was thought to be interesting, but it wasn't something that people were thinking a lot about. It's in that, you can see which one I mean, I hope. It's Oh My, and it's on display in the dining room at Castle Howard in Yorkshire. That's where it was when we did the catalogue, and that's where I first saw it. It was another of those painted of his own volition pictures, as in no money changes hands. Reynolds wants to paint Oh My, so he gets painted, he gets exhibited at the Royal Academy. Then the family offered it. It gets very personal now. The family offered it for sale. And I used to work at the Tate, and I was a curator at the Tate in 2000. And we wanted to buy it. And we mounted, you may remember, we mounted a campaign. And the family, there was a lot of haggling over how much is this picture worth. We got down to £6 million. Okay? And then we said, okay, well, we can pay $6 million. And they said, actually, we need $6.5 million. So we said, oh, that's not so easy. So Nick Sirota, the director, and I, because I was head of collections then, we got somebody to give the extra $500,000. And they said, fine, you need $500,000, here's $500,000. So we went to the government. So we've got $6.5 million. We went to the DCMS, and they said, it's not worth $6.5 million. You can't buy it. And so we lost it. And so it remained with the owner, the man who had bought it. But I borrowed it for an exhibition in 2005. And that's us borrowing that's my art handlers at the Tate, my colleagues. We borrowed it for this exhibition, The Creation of Celebrity, in 2005. When it still belonged to the private owner, we put it on the cover. We had it at the Tate. We took it to Ferrara. And then it still remained with the owner. And then last year, it came into the public domain. Reynolds' portrait of Oh My at risk of leaving the UK. And so another attempt had to be made to buy it. But of course, by now, and I'm not bitter, would I be bitter? The recommended price is £50 million. So, good for the National Portrait Gallery. They couldn't raise 50 million themselves, so they got into bed with the Getty, which actually was quite astute. And so, just last month, the unveiling of as he is now called, because that was his real name, was unveiled by the National Portrait Gallery, jointly by the Getty and the National Portrait Gallery in London. I think it's a poignant story. I think it's very good. What is money after all, if it's not for buying things? But that's a different story. But I think it's a very good way to end. 300 years later, Reynolds does really matter. And this is the most expensive portrait by any British artist. And it is a portrait that transcends its time, its genre, and the individual who sat or stood for the portrait. And I think it's a great testament to why Reynolds still matters 300 years later in 2023. Thank you.